now time to arrest Donald Trump and detain him at Gitmo. By this point, it is impossible to be shocked anymore, but Trump's attorneys have now stochastically threatened the Supreme Court and again threatened the nation with, quote, bedlam, unquote. Oh, and chaos and bedlam. In their filing to the Supreme Court demanding that it overrule the Colorado 14th Amendment disqualification finding and similar attempts in other states and in other court cases. Trump's lawyers last night wrote that the bids to enforce the Constitution, quote, threaten to disenfranchise tens of millions of Americans and promise to unleash chaos and bedlam, unquote. Trump's stochastic threats of terror, of bloodshed, of violence, of disorder, and now of chaos and bedlam are so numerous that there is no accurate counting of them. They are, in fact, so numerous that Trump is now into reruns. Trump, January 9th.
They feel this is the way they're going to try and win, and that's not the way it goes. It'll be bedlam in the country.
If you said that, and then 9 days later, your lawyers told the Supreme Court of the United States that if it did not rule in your favor, that chaos and bedlam would be unleashed, and you made sure you put the word promise in there before those other loaded words, you would be arrested for making terroristic threats, especially if you were now making them on an average of one every 10 days or so. I no longer care about the institutional consequences, long-term, or even this November. Abraham Lincoln did not care about the institutional consequences long-term when he had to count on the elasticity of those institutions in order to save this nation by inventing things like war powers and ignoring Supreme Court rulings in 1861 and 62 and 3 and 4 and 5. Subsequent generations were left to deal with the consequences of those things, and none of them have shirked that responsibility nor suggested Lincoln was wrong. We are at that point again, where the future of this country requires a willingness, if the conservative traditions will serve only to enable a madman to destroy the United States, to go beyond the conservative traditions. Donald Trump is a terrorist. He is threatening sweeping political violence, chaos, and bedlam if he does not get his way. That is, by definition, terrorism. He should be detained today. I believe we have an off-the-mainland facility where we have kept people, which previous presidential administrations have determined, without slowing themselves down and worrying over due process, were terrorists. I believe there is probably a current equivalent of the black sites that previous presidential administrations have used when the level of complexity was raised by the fact that the terrorist suspect was also an American citizen. The Biden administration should use these processes, these precedents, these locations, and use them now. There certainly will be consequences serious and untold, and perhaps at this point unimaginable, and bluntly, no matter what the hell they are, they will be better and easier to address than letting Trump continue to threaten the nation and perhaps regain the power to control the nation and end all semblance of representative government in the nation. Dealing with Trump in Gitmo in 2024 will be a hell of a lot easier than dealing with Trump in the White House in 2025 until he decides when to leave. The irony of timing. That filing comes barely 16 hours after two utterly unexpected and presumably utterly unknowing confessions by Trump. Quote, a president of the United States must have full immunity. Even events that, quote, cross the line, unquote, must fall under total immunity. Trump, panicking, trying to fight through the fog of his disintegrating mind, to convince himself he will not die in prison, posting on social media, literally at 2 o'clock in the morning, but in so doing, accomplishing something I don't think people are recognizing. That social media post about crossing the line and full immunity, that is a confession. And yes, the obvious non-confession things are still true. Combine this with his lawyer's arguments to the D.C. Appeals Court and now the Supreme Court. And yes, Trump is arguing a president could order an ex-president killed or you killed, and he would never be prosecuted for it. And yes, what he describes is not a president's immunity, but a dictator's immunity. And yes, no president has ever had total immunity. No president has ever needed total immunity. Even Richard Nixon, who infamously said, and he was 3 years out of office when he said it, well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. Even Nixon came back 16 days later in a 2,500-word statement to the old newspaper, The Washington Star, and he also said, quote, I do not believe and would not argue that a president is above the law. Of course he is not. And Nixon then went on to say he meant legal latitude in emergencies, like Lincoln during the Civil War. If you've heard that from anybody recently. But lost in the horror of that Trump post is the confession in Trump's post. It is, in fact, two confessions. The first to the fact that even he realizes that there is not now anything like presidential immunity, and he wants it established. And all his language in that post is in the future tense or the hypothetical. And forgive me for parsing the rantings of a madman, but this is a confession that what he is now asking a district court to give him, and what he will almost certainly then ask the Supreme Court to give him, if he has not killed its members by then, what he is going to ask them does not currently exist. Quote, a president of the United States must have full immunity, without which it would be impossible for him, her, to properly function. Any mistake, even if well-intended, would be met with almost certain indictment by the opposing party, unquote. Firstly, no previous former president has ever been indicted with the Department of Justice under the other party's control or under the control of his own party. Nixon expected to be indicted by a DOJ run by Republicans. Nixon was pardoned. Probably most presidents have broken the law. George W. Bush certainly did with torture. Obama confirmed before his own inauguration that his administration would not pursue anybody for torturing prisoners. Reagan broke the law in Iran-Contra, certainly, in other areas probably. What Trump is saying here is that from now on, any president who breaks the law will be prosecuted as an act of political revenge. And on the facts, he's mistaken, of course, but the premise is not insane. Certainly it is not as insane as the previous version of this claim that all presidents have had immunity. This is something different. He is asking for something for the future. There is also something else in those opening two sentences that is of importance, but I want to come back to that separately, and I will do so in a moment. To resume quoting what might be the most revelatory Trump statement ever, quote, even events that cross the line must fall under total immunity, or it will be years of trauma trying to determine good from bad. There must be certainty. Again, you can take this as another threat or as a prediction. Either way, it's not crazy. It may be wrong, but it is not crazy. Resuming the quotation, example, you can't stop police from doing the job of strong and effective crime prevention because you want to guard against the occasional rogue cop or bad apple. Sometimes you just have to live with great but slightly imperfect. All presidents must have complete and total presidential immunity, or the authority and decisiveness of a president of the United States will be stripped and gone forever. Hopefully this will be an easy decision. God bless the Supreme Court, unquote. The court he would threaten with chaos and bedlam less than a day later. Ignore the self-congratulation, the self-pity, and his new mandatory dragging of God into this, which is part of the Trump 2024 God-con rollout I mentioned earlier in the week. To me, the keys in this are, one, that he posits presidential immunity as something that does not currently exist. And whether he knows it or not, that means that if it were to be established, as he hopes, it could not be done so retroactively. It would not apply to the Trump presidency of 2017 to 2021. So that's the first confession. Whether he meant to confess or he did not mean to confess, he confessed. He confessed there is not presidential immunity. He just wants there to be. The second confession is subtler. Let me read its two components. A president of the United States must have full immunity, without which it would be impossible for him, her to properly function. Any mistake, even if well intended, etc. Mistake? There is the implication here that Trump may be trying to pass off his crimes as mistakes. Outlandish, of course, but even for him to approach confessing to mere mistakes is startling. Mistakes? January 6th was not a beautiful day? There weren't good people on both sides in Charlottesville? Trying to get the vice president hanged was an oopsie? Also note that Trump later in this post compares himself to the, quote, occasional rogue cop or bad apple, and says you just have to live with great but slightly imperfect, unquote. In anybody else, this would read like a mass murderer claiming he only meant the first 10 or 12. Come on. But coming from Trump, and I'm not ignoring his attempt to pass off a threat against Biden and Obama and Clinton as some civic-minded plea, but coming from Trump, this almost reads like borderline self-awareness and a plea bargain. Don't send me to prison or disqualify me from the ballot. I'm just a rogue cop, a bad apple. Great but slightly imperfect. I made a mistake. Don't get me wrong. I am not suggesting for a moment that Trump has had an epiphany here. Maybe a Freudian slip. The Supreme Court filing threatening chaos and bedlam confirms no epiphanies round this house. And we know offered a deal this minute in which he has to personally kill every member of his own family, but he regains power and avoids prison. He would do it before our first commercial break. Elsewhere, after weeks of letting speculation and fear fill the news void, Fulton County, Georgia, District Attorney Fani Willis has finally said something about the accusation that could wreck the Trump case there. And what she has said is as explosive as what was said about her. This charge from the wife of the attorney Willis hired as a prosecutor in the Trump case that her husband and Willis were having an affair. The wife, Joycelyn Wade, is, quote, using the legal process to harass and embarrass District Attorney Willis, and in doing so is obstructing and interfering with an ongoing criminal prosecution. The filing to the court hearing the prosecutions continues. Mrs. Wade, quote, has conspired with interested parties in the criminal election interference case to use the civil discovery process to annoy, embarrass, and oppress District Attorney Willis. The filing also says Willis knows nothing about the Wade's marriage, except that both sides have filed legal paperwork indicating the marriage was irretrievably broken after Mrs. Wade had an affair, and that the district attorney should not have to give a deposition for the divorce case. The filing was made after the judge hearing all of this, Scott McAfee, the only judge in the Atlanta, Georgia area, demanded a written response from Fani Willis by February 2nd and scheduled an evidentiary hearing for 13 days after that. Willis makes no denial of an affair. On the other hand, there doesn't need to be one. What there is the implication that the defendant who brought all this up and then questioned the entire validity of the prosecution, the one-time Trump flunky Mike Roman, could now face additional charges. Willis used the phrase obstructing and interfering with an ongoing criminal prosecution. Additional charges against Roman, charges against Mrs. Wade are implied, but none have been filed. On the other hand, in Washington, Trump's stall in the election subversion case gained an unfortunate legal stamp of approval. Judge Chutkan said no, she would not be setting pretrial deadlines based on the idea that Trump's lawyers should be preparing everything now anyway during the freeze over the presidential immunity bullshit in case they lose it. He has won a delay regardless of what happens to the presidential immunity claim. It will be weeks. It might even be months. It certainly means that if you bought the official trial date, the start date of March 4th for the election subversion case and the Jack Smith prosecution, if you took March 4th in the office pool, you've already lost. Back in New York, where Judge Kaplan did not jail Trump for contempt and where Trump did not return yesterday for another day of daring him to do it, one begins to wonder if Alina Habba is actually an anti-Trump plant. That person is an idiot. Per Gadfly reporter Matthew Russell Lee of Inner City Press, Judge, you've taken enough time on this. Habba, may I be heard? Judge, no. Habba, I can't ask about them? With all due respect, Judge, with all due respect, when I rule, you go on. Habba, so do you, E. Jean Carroll's lawyer, objection. Judge, sustained, stricken. Habba, on what basis? Judge, move on. Later, Habba to E. Jean Carroll. And you've been on left-leaning platforms? Carroll's lawyer. Objection. Judge, sustained. Habba, are they left-leaning? Judge, did you not hear me? Once again, I can fake being smart. No, you can't. Others, maybe. You, Ms. Habba? No, not at all. Trial continues Monday. Also of interest here, the Republican plant group led by Joe Lieberman, No Scruples. I'm sorry, I wrote that down wrong. No Labels. The Republican plant group No Labels reaches out to Nikki Haley to be their presidential candidate, and she actually says, no thanks, no scruples. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Postscripts to the news, some headlines, some updates, some snark, some predictions. Dateline No Labels National Headquarters, inside Republican National Headquarters, Washington. Quote, if Governor Haley does not succeed in obtaining the Republican nomination for president, says Joe Lieberman, who actually is still alive, except for his soul, which died in the year 2000, and she declares any interest in being part of our bipartisan unity ticket, I'm sure the people at No Labels would give that the most serious consideration. Does Lieberman really think he's fooling anybody? He's not even fooling Haley. A spokesperson told Politico, quote, Nikki has no interest in No Labels. She's happy with the Republican label. Dateline Mar-a-Lago. Rather amazingly, Haley appears to still be alive for the vice presidential spot on a Trump ticket. She's already demanded cognitive tests for candidates older than 75. On the other hand, she's already pre-endorsed Trump's nomination. The hardliners really don't want her. Matt Gaetz says she'd be a, quote, establishment neocon fantasy and a MAGA nightmare, and Trump is reportedly being warned that if he picks her or anybody else, even partially acceptable to the, non-fascist wing of the party, he should prepare to watch Haley or whoever he picks align with mainstream Republican senators to remove him from the presidency and elevate her to it during his second term. Nice people you attract. So I keep getting asked who is the vice president for Trump if he wins the nomination, and the theory is Trump can't trust anybody to try to not outshine him in order to succeed him, unless he finds a Dick Cheney type who has no interest in succeeding him. Ironic model Veep there, given Liz Cheney. He would really like a Dick Cheney type who's not from the political world. Among those from the political world, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, because Trump admires his money. Senator Tim Scott, because Trump hasn't figured it out yet. Senator Marsha Blackburn, because, okay, on this one, they've stumped me. This makes no sense at all. Ben Carson, Glenn Youngkin, J.D. Vance, Kristi Noem, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, though he's mad at her for waiting to endorse him, and of course, shameless, amoral opportunist Elise Stefanik. You know who I think Trump should pick? Nick Ayers. You know who Nick Ayers is? He was the chief of staff of an erstwhile Trump world figure, and Nick Ayers endorsed Trump yesterday. Nick Ayers was the chief of staff to Mike Pence. And if he could endorse Trump after what Trump tried to do to Mike Pence, he is both evil enough and masochistic enough to serve Trump. Still ahead on this edition of Countdown, we tend to think of the destruction of culture and literature as some sort of 21st century phenomenon. In fact, America has always dumbed down, at least in spots, even as other parts of it have smartened up. In 1937, James Thurber was already bemoaning the dumbening. Americans smart enough to travel the world, yet stupid enough to complain about Shakespeare's Macbeth because it did not follow the rules of paperback fiction. The Macbeth murder mystery, one of my favorites in Fridays with Thurber, next. First time for the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The Bronze, worse, Metro UK, a kind of sassy British news website which tweeted out something bizarre. The only thing you really need to know in advance is that the British outfit called the Met Office is actually the Meteorology Office. It does the weather. The tweet, quote, "The Met Office warns the UK will be double-fisted by deadly snow and ice." Now, this might have gone by unnoticed, except the Met Office itself took dignified offense to this and replied, quote, "Needless to say, this isn't a term we'd use to describe the weather." I'm now compelled to tell you for some reason that on July 30th, 2011, the Seattle Mariners traded a pitcher named Doug Fister to the Detroit Tigers for pitchers Chance Ruffin and Charlie Furbush. It was, of course, the Fister-Ruffin-Furbush trade. Moving on. The runner-up, worser, Larry Elder. I have to tell you that for a long time, I thought Larry Elder was a bit. Some comedian fiercely dedicated to an alternate persona. He had this great concept of a conservative idiot with a specialty for stepping on rakes. You know, kind of like Dave Chappelle's blind KKK leader. A fringe radio talk show host, Larry has run for and lost or bailed out for the California Senate, the California governorship, and the presidency. But Larry Elder has now topped even himself, I think. At 4:13 yesterday morning Eastern Time, he posted what might be the saddest thing I have ever read on Twitter X. Quote, "Dear Elon Musk, why does my number of followers barely change day to day despite how often I post and how clever and meaningful the content? Please be advised, there is deep state at X, and with all due respect, you are so busy and distracted that you don't even know it," unquote. Mr. Elder has inadvertently defined MAGA and the Republican Party and the 21st century Trumpian culture of, "I'm an infallible genius. I know this because I'm also omniscient." It couldn't be. Even as some of Elder's fellow right-wing trolls noted that his timeline consists mostly of links to websites he's being paid to promote, therefore nobody wants to follow him. It couldn't be something else that you also might discern from his timeline, or just from hearing him talk. Namely that even for MAGA, Larry Elder is really dumb. No, it's the deep state. As tweeter Larry Downing noted, the deep state is when people don't like my posts. Have some self-respect and just buy some bot followers, Elder. But our winner, Tucker Carlson. Remember Tucker Carlson? He has another Twitter video out 4 years after Twitter videos stopped being a thing. Only this one is another attempt at gaslighting about January 6th, and I say attempt because I don't think Tucker Carlson and the conspiracy theorist he had on with him, Sleazy McBad Haircut or whatever his name is, really realized what they were implying. Carlson's text atop his video reads, quote, "It seems likely that government officials were involved in planting pipe bombs in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago as part of an effort to keep Donald Trump from running for president again." So, Tucker, when the pipe bombs were planted in Washington on January 5th, 2021, it was the government who did it? The government on January 5th, 2021 was the Trump government. Tucker Carlson says the Trump government planted the January 2021 pipe bombs in Washington. Well done, Tucker. You've underscored my opening point. Time to send Trump to Gitmo. Tucker Carlson. What an asshole. Today's worst person in the world. Fridays with Thurber and the works of the master, and one I have not read to you here before, but is one of my favorites because it is, well, you'll hear. Fridays with Thurber and the Macbeth Murder Mystery by James Thurber. "It was a stupid mistake to make," said the American woman I had met at my hotel in the English Lake Country. "But it was on the counter with the other Penguin books, the little sixpenny ones, you know, with the paper covers. And I supposed, of course, it was a detective story. All the others were detective stories. I'd read all the others. So I bought this one without really looking at it carefully. You can imagine how mad I was when I found it was Shakespeare." I murmured something sympathetically. "I don't see why the Penguin books people had to get out Shakespeare's plays in the same size and everything as the detective stories," went on my companion. "I think they have different colored jackets," I said. "Well, I didn't notice that," she said. "Anyway, I got real comfy in bed that night and all ready to read a good mystery story, and here I had The Tragedy of Macbeth, a book for high school students, like Ivanhoe." "Or Lorna Doone," I said. "Exactly," said the American lady. "And I was just crazy for a good Agatha Christie or something. Hercule Poirot is my favorite detective." "Is he the rabbity one?" I asked. "Oh, no," said my crime fiction expert. "He's the Belgian one. You're thinking of Mr. Pinkerton, the one that helps Inspector Bull. He's good, too." Over her second cup of tea, my companion began to tell me the plot of a detective story that had fooled her completely. It seems it was the old family doctor all the time. But I cut in on her. "Tell me," I said, "did you read Macbeth?" "I had to read it," she said. "There wasn't a scrap of anything else to read in the whole room." "Did you like it?" I asked. "No, I did not," she said decisively. "In the first place, I don't think for a moment that Macbeth did it." I looked at her blankly. "Did what?" I asked. "I don't think for a moment that he killed the king," she said. "I don't think the Macbeth woman was mixed up in it either. You suspect them the most, of course, but those are the ones that are never guilty, or shouldn't be anyway." I'm afraid," I began, "that I—" "But don't you see?" said the American lady. "It would spoil everything if you could figure out right away who did it. Shakespeare was too smart for that. I've read that people never have figured out Hamlet, so it isn't likely Shakespeare would have made Macbeth as simple as it seems." I thought this over while I filled my pipe. "Who do you suspect?" I asked suddenly. "McDuff," she said promptly. "Good God," I whispered softly. "Oh, McDuff did it all right," said the murder specialist. "Hercule Poirot would have gotten him easily." "How did you figure it out?" I demanded. "Well," she said, "I didn't right away. At first I suspected Banquo. And then, of course, he was the second person killed. That was good right in there, that part. The person you suspect of the first murder should always be the second victim." "Is that so?" I murmured. "Oh, yes," said my informant. "They have to keep surprising you. Well, after the second murder, I didn't know who the killer was for a while." How about Malcolm and Donalbain, the king's sons?" I asked. "As I remember it, they fled right after the first murder. That looks suspicious." "Too suspicious," said the American lady. "Much too suspicious. When they flee, they're never guilty. You can count on that." "I believe," I said, "I'll have a brandy," and I summoned the waiter. My companion leaned toward me, her eyes bright, her teacup quivering. "Do you know who discovered Duncan's body?" she demanded. I said I was sorry, but I had forgotten. "McDuff discovers it," she said, slipping into the historical present. "Then he comes running downstairs and shouts, 'Confusion has broke open the Lord's anointed temple, and sacrilegious murder has made his masterpiece,' and on like that." The good lady tapped me on the knee. "All that stuff was rehearsed," she said. "You wouldn't say a lot of stuff like that offhand, would you, if you'd found a body?" She fixed me with a glittering eye. I began. "You're right," she said. "You wouldn't, unless you had practiced it in advance. My God, there's a body in here, is what an innocent man would say." She sat back with a confident glare. I thought for a while. "But what do you make of the third murderer?" I asked. "You know, the third murderer has puzzled Macbeth scholars for 300 years. "That's because they never thought of McDuff," said the American lady. "It was McDuff, I'm certain. You couldn't have one of the victims murdered by two ordinary thugs. The murderer always has to be somebody important." "But what about the banquet scene?" I asked after a moment. "How do you account for Macbeth's guilty actions there when Banquo's ghost came in and sat in his chair?" The lady leaned forward and tapped me on the knee again. "There wasn't any ghost," she said. "A big, strong man like that doesn't go around seeing ghosts, especially in a brightly lighted banquet hall with dozens of people around. Macbeth was shielding somebody." "Who was he shielding?" I asked. "Mrs. Macbeth, of course," she said. "He thought she did it, and he was going to take the rap himself. The husband always does that when the wife is suspected." "But what," I demanded, "about the sleepwalking scene then?" "The same thing, only the other way around," said my companion. "That time, she was shielding him. She wasn't asleep at all. Do you remember where it says, 'Enter Lady Macbeth with a taper'?" "Yes," I said. "Well, people who walk in their sleep never carry lights," said my fellow traveler. "They have a second sight. Did you ever hear of a sleepwalker carrying a light?" "No," I said, I never did." "Well, then she wasn't asleep. She was acting guilty to shield Macbeth." "I think," I said, "I'll have another brandy," and I called the waiter. When he brought it, I drank it rapidly and rose to go. "I believe," I said, "that you have got hold of something. Would you lend me that Macbeth? I'd like to look it over tonight. I don't feel somehow as if I've ever really read it." "I'll get it for you," she said, "but you'll find that I'm right." I read the play over carefully that night, and the next morning after breakfast I sought out the American woman. She was on the putting green, and I came up behind her silently and took her arm. She gave an exclamation. "Could I see you alone?" I asked in a low voice. She nodded cautiously and followed me to a secluded spot. "You found out something," she breathed. "I've found out," I said triumphantly, "the name of the murderer." "You mean it wasn't Macduff?" she said. "Macduff is as innocent of those murders, I said, as Macbeth and the Macbeth woman. I opened the copy of the play, which I had with me, and turned to Act 2, Scene 2. Here, I said, you will see where Lady Macbeth says, I laid their daggers ready, he could not miss 'em. Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. Do you see? No, said the American woman bluntly. I don't. But it's simple, I exclaimed. I wonder I didn't see it years ago. The reason Duncan resembled Lady Macbeth's father as he slept is that it actually was her father. Good God, breathed my companion softly. Lady Macbeth's father killed the king, I said, and hearing someone coming, thrust the body under the bed and crawled into the bed himself. But, said the lady, you can't have a murderer who only appears in the story once. You can't have that. I know that, I said, and I turned to Act 2, Scene 4. It says here, enter Ross with an old man. Now, that old man is never identified, and it is my contention that he was old Mr. Macbeth, whose ambition it was to make his daughter queen. There, you have your motive. But even then, cried the American lady, he's still a minor character. Not, I said gleefully, when you realize that he was also one of the weird sisters in disguise. You mean one of those 3 witches? Precisely, I said. Listen to this speech of the old man's. On Tuesday last, a falcon, towering in her pride of place, was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed. Who does that sound like? It sounds like the way the 3 witches talk, said my companion reluctantly. Precisely, I said again. Well, said the American woman, maybe you're right, but I'm sure I am, I said. And do you know what I'm going to do now? No, she said. What? Buy a copy of Hamlet, I said, and solve that. My companion's eyes brightened. Then, she said, you don't think Hamlet did it? I am, I said. Absolutely positive he did not. But who? She demanded. Who do you suspect? I looked at her cryptically. Everybody, I said, and disappeared into a small grove of trees as silently as I had come. The Macbeth Murder Mystery by James Thurber. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. I love that story. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, arranged and performed by No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Stevie Van Zandt, and everything else was pretty much my fault. And that's Countdown for this, the 294th day until the 2024 U.S. presidential election and the 1,109th day since Dementia J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the 14th Amendment, use the Insurrection Act, use the justice system to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.